In this reflection, we will take a closer look at one of the most demanding and debated aspects of Yeshua's ethics, love of enemies and nonviolence. This is the point where his teaching no longer concerns only personal morality, but directly challenges our assumptions about power, justice, and how societies respond to conflict. Many experience these words as unrealistic or even dangerous. Others reduce them to inward attitudes with no concrete consequences. In the main part of this reflection, we will therefore explore what Yeshua actually teaches, how he himself lives this ethic in the face of violence, how nonviolence has functioned in modern historical experience, and how rabbinic Judaism in the diaspora develops a related, but not identical, response to powerlessness and persecution. Finally, we will gather the threads in a clear and structured conclusion. When Yeshua speaks about loving one's enemies, he moves into a domain where ethics can no longer be separated from conflict. It is relatively easy to speak about love of neighbor in safe and stable circumstances. Love of enemies, however, presupposes that something is at stake. It presupposes injustice, threat, loss, and fear. For this reason, many feel compelled either to explain these words away or to relegate them to an unattainable ideal. But in Yeshua's teaching, love of enemies is not an abstract ideal detached from practice. It is presented as a concrete way of acting in situations of hostility. Nor is it about emotions. Yeshua does not ask people to feel affection toward those who harm them. He asks them to act differently than the logic of violence demands. Love of enemies is therefore primarily a choice, not a feeling. The logic of violence is simple and intuitive. It tells us that injustice must be met with force, that threats must be neutralized, and that retaliation restores balance. The problem is that this logic rarely stops there. Violence shapes those who use it. It produces enemy images, justifies further escalation, and gradually lowers moral thresholds. Yeshua appears to recognize this clearly. His ethic is therefore not oriented toward victory, but toward breaking the cycle of escalation. This does not stand in opposition to the intention of the Torah. The law of retaliation was originally meant to limit violence, not encourage it. It was designed to prevent conflicts from spiraling out of control. Yeshua goes further and asks what happens if one does not merely limit retaliation, but renounces it altogether. Not because injustice is unreal, but because violence is never neutral. When Yeshua speaks of turning the other cheek, going the extra mile, or giving also one's cloak, these sayings have often been misunderstood as calls to passive submission. In their historical context, however, they describe actions that disrupt the expectations of power. They expose violence as violence. They refuse to play the role the oppressor assigns. This is not weakness, but a form of active resistance without weapons. Nonviolence in Yeshua's teaching is therefore not the absence of action, but a different kind of action. It does not seek to defeat the enemy physically, but to expose the emptiness of violence itself. It refuses to turn the enemy into a monster, and in doing so refuses to become monstrous in response. Modern experiences with nonviolence confirm many of these insights. In the 20th century, several movements consciously chose nonviolence not primarily out of idealism, but out of realism. For many, nonviolence was the only available strategy. They lacked military power, political influence, and weapons. Yet nonviolence proved capable of effecting change, though in a very different way than violence. Nonviolence does not operate through coercion, but through delegitimization. Power depends on narratives that justify its actions. When power encounters violence, it can always respond with greater violence while maintaining its moral self-image. When power encounters disciplined nonviolence, a tension arises. Violence becomes visible. It can no longer be concealed behind claims of order or necessity. This does not mean that nonviolence always succeeds in outward terms. Many nonviolent movements have been crushed. Many people have paid with imprisonment or with their lives. Yet history also shows that violent victories often give rise to new forms of oppression. Power changes hands, but the structure remains. Nonviolence does not primarily seek to seize power, but to transform the relationship to power itself. Nonviolence is demanding. It requires inner discipline, communal support, and long-term commitment. It requires people to confront anger and the desire for revenge without denying them. For this reason, nonviolence is rarely an individual project. It must be carried by a community. This resonates strongly with Yeshua's approach, as he does not address isolated individuals, but forms a community meant to live differently within the world. Crucial to understanding Yeshua's ethic is the fact that he does not merely teach this way of life, but lives it himself. The Gospels agree that he does not resist physically when he is arrested. He does not organize armed defense. He does not attempt to save himself through force, and he stops his followers when they resort to violence. At the same time, he is not silent. In the Gospel of John, this is especially clear when Yeshua, after being struck, points out the injustice of the act. He does not strike back, but neither does he accept the violence as legitimate. In the Synoptic Gospels, this is expressed differently. There, he is largely silent during the trials, but this silence functions as a form of non-cooperation. He refuses to legitimize an unjust process. The silence is not submission, but exposure. In this way, there is no gap between Yeshua's teaching and his life. Love of enemies is not articulated from a position of safety, but lived under extreme pressure. The crucifixion thus becomes not only a theological symbol, but an ethical testimony. Yeshua does not die merely for what he says, but for how he lives. This also opens a broader perspective. Is this form of nonviolence unique to Yeshua, or does it appear elsewhere within Jewish tradition? When we look at rabbinic Judaism as it develops in the diaspora, a striking picture emerges. After the destruction of the temple and the failed revolts against Rome, rabbinic leaders come to recognize that violent messianism leads to catastrophe. The response is not renewed rebellion, but a fundamental reconfiguration of Jewish life. The temple is replaced by study, prayer, halakhic practice, and communal life. The struggle is moved from the battlefield to the text. This is not principled pacifism. Rabbinic Judaism does not reject self-defense in theory, but in practice, a way of life emerges that prioritizes survival, continuity, and ethical integrity over heroic resistance. The principle that saving life overrides nearly all commandments becomes central. Life is valued more highly than vengeance. In the diaspora, Jews live for centuries without state power or military force. Persecution is rarely met with organized violence. Instead, strategies of endurance develop: legal adaptation, cultural resistance, textual identity. Protest does not disappear, but it is expressed through lament, prayer, and theological argument, even argument directed at God. Here, a clear point of contact with Yeshua's ethic appears. Both represent a break with violent messianism. Both demonstrate ways of preserving human dignity under powerlessness without mirroring the violence endured. The differences are real, but the lived experience is related. This also corrects simplistic contrasts between Christian grace and Jewish law. In practice, Jewish communities in the diaspora often lived more consistently non-violent lives than Christian majority societies, precisely because they lack the power to theologically legitimize violence. Thus, love of enemies and non-violence emerge as more than ideals. They appear as historically grounded ways of preserving humanity under pressure, not as guarantees of success, but as paths that refuse to grant violence the final word. There is also a meaningful parallel here to the figure of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53. In Jewish interpretation, this chapter does not speak about an individual Messiah, but about the Jewish people themselves, especially Israel in exile. It describes a community that suffers injustice, is misunderstood and humiliated, yet does not respond with violence. The servant does not cry out, does not strike back, and does not seize power, but bears suffering without reproducing it. The suffering is not idealized, and it is not sought. It is tragic, yet it becomes meaningful because it exposes injustice and preserves ethical integrity under pressure. Read in this light, Yeshua does not replace the suffering servant, nor does he stand outside this tradition. Rather, he lives in continuity with it. His refusal of violence reflects a deeply Jewish response to powerlessness, shaped by exile rather than conquest, by endurance rather than domination. Let us now briefly summarize this reflection. For the first point, love of enemies in Yeshua's teaching is not an emotion, but a concrete practice that interrupts the cycle of violence. For the second point, non-violence does not mean passivity, but an active way of exposing and delegitimizing injustice. For the third point, Yeshua lived in accordance with his teaching, and his non-violence was clear, deliberate, and uncompromising. For the fourth point, modern historical experience shows that nonviolence can be both realistic and effective without destroying a society's ethical foundation. For the fifth point, rabbinic Judaism in the diaspora developed a related ethic in which life, text, and community were chosen over violent resistance. And for the sixth point, love of enemies is not a utopian ideal, but a demanding and coherent path for preserving human dignity in the face of hostility. Thank you for listening to this reflection. May your search for truth be guided by clarity rather than fear, by courage rather than force, and by a commitment to life and dignity in all its forms. Peace and blessing to you.